All right, so Pete, I've started recording, so whenever you are ready, we're good to go.
Anybody else have anything they'd love to check in about? We don't want to cut this part off. It's the fun part. Is everybody good?
We're good.
I think you're going to have warmer weather in Seattle than we have in Sarasota this week, because we're having terrible rainstorms that are going to cool things down. So, well, like I said, we're going to be doing a little travel log today. Last week, we started where most conversations about religion in America began, with the arrival of the Mayflower. But for 80 years before that event in 1620, Christians and Native Americans had been interacting in what is now the Southwest United States. We're going to do some junior high history. So you probably remember the very first Spanish incursion into the territories that became the United States in the West was Coronado's expedition in search of the 7 cities of gold. And that was in 1540. He took an army of 400 with about 1,500 Mexican Indian allies and just 4 Franciscan priests. And he went in search of a fabled city that was called Quivira. Now, if you go to the Southwest, you'll hear a wonderful folktale that there was an indigenous informant that the Spanish nicknamed the Turk, who told Coronado that this wealthy city was much farther east and farther north. Obviously, the Turk was probably sending Coronado on a wild goose chase. And Coronado actually did make it all the way to Kansas. And then he limped home, stopped in the New Mexico territory, and finally arrived back in Mexico City to really personal and economic ruin. Now, as he went across New Mexico, he encountered what have come to be called Pueblos, which are indigenous Native American communities. And at almost every turn, he used violence against the Native Americans, breaking into their villages, extracting tribute, and then moving on. It said he was in search of the city of Quivira, but it could very well be that his scout that he had sent out a year earlier had seen and identified as the Golden City what is now today called the Acoma Pueblo. And so to help us understand the interplay between the Spanish and Native American culture, I'd like to focus particularly on the Acoma Pueblo. Well, as I said, if you've never made a trip to the Southwest, I heartily recommend it. I've been there a number of times, and I think it's really the main portal we can follow into ancient times and practices like nothing else we see anywhere in the United States. The forebears to the Pueblo people were the cliff-dwelling inhabitants of Mesa Verde, the inhabitants of Canyon de Chelly, and what was the largest community that ever was built in the Southwest, Chaco Canyon. So Chaco Canyon, that largest site in the Southwest, was built between 900 and 1150 AD. And if you drive out into the desert and visit it, there are 15 major complexes that have been through an archaeological dig and are there for interpretation. And so I want to start. I'm going to start with my sharing on the pictures of Acoma. I mean of Chaco. So these are the ruins at Chaco Canyon. This is Pueblo Bonito. And you'll see how extensive it was. There's a, back here is a wall that collapsed. This used to all be 4-story buildings at the back of the archaeological site, and they've since collapsed. So next I want to show you a picture of an artistic rendering of what life would have been like there at the Pueblo Bonito. And if we remember from that first site I showed you, there's so many circles, and each of those circles is what's called a kiva. And this is the largest kiva in the Southwest. You can see it's circular, and it would have been covered with a first a thatched roof and then plaster on it, and it would have been entered through a ladder that came in from the top. Next is a picture. This is what the inside of a kiva looks like. This one is at the Aztec Ruin north of Chaco Canyon, and they've reconstructed it to what it would look like. And you see down here these large squares. These would have been covered with animal skins, and Kachina dancers would have danced on them like they were living drums. So that's just a quick look at that Southwest and the kind of culture that began. Now, they used to talk about, what became of the people of Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde. Where'd they disappear to? Well, they didn't disappear at all. They simply became the inhabitants of the 29 pueblos that are scattered across the Southwest. Now, on my last trip, I was able to have a tour of what was called our Acoma Pueblo that we're focusing on today, and especially what's called the Sky City Butte Top Community and Cultural Museum. And that's where a lot of what I'm going to tell you I got today, along with some research, because our guide told a really honest and brutal story of the toll that contact with the Spanish had brought upon his people. The first Spanish mention of Acoma was Coronado's guide or scout in 1539. And then Coronado passed by and couldn't inhabit that one because it was so well protected. But in his account, Coronado said that it was a very strange place built upon solid rock and one of the strongest places we have ever seen. So Coronado passed through. We didn't have any Spanish contact until 1581 with a small band, 12 soldiers, 5 Franciscan priests, 13 other Indian servants came to Acoma to try to begin the negotiations to establish trade. They wanted to establish trade with Acoma because it was so successful. We're talking about the New Mexico desert. And yet Acoma had solved its water problems and its agricultural problems, and therefore would have been for the Spanish an incredible source of supplies. Well, that then takes us to the next encounter, 1599, which was a murderous disaster for the Acoma people. Again, a small Spanish expedition stopped at Acoma to barter for food supplies. When they couldn't get them, they took them, and the Acoma attacked them and killed 7 Spaniards, including the nephew of the newly appointed territorial governor. This governor Juan Duanate had been sent to establish Santa Fe as the capital of the viceroy there. And so when he caught wind that his nephew had been killed, he sent a bigger army. Now it's interesting to note, Onate was married to the granddaughter of Cortez, but she was also the great-granddaughter of Montezuma. Mm-hmm. So intermarriage was already being used as a political tool in the 1500s in New Spain. So on January 21st, 1599, another nephew reached Acoma, this time with 70 soldiers, and the Acoma massacre started the next day and lasted for 3 days. They breached the wall on January 23rd. They dragged their cannon into the village and began toppling adobe walls and homes, and they burned most of the village, and they killed on site 800 inhabitants and imprisoned 500 more. The 500 slaves, the men among them had their foot cut off and then were put into servitude for the next 20 years. The women were sent as concubines out into other parts of the Pueblos and other parts of the Spanish enclave.
They always do with the women.
So, so this had gone on, And so Acoma had been made the example of Spanish control and conquering. And when I was there, our guide took us to the north side of the mesa and could show us a row of homes from 1599 that are still there that had the burn marks on the backs of their buildings. So all of this is still contemporary among the people of the Acoma. So by 1620, Santa Fe had been established. This was now a viceroyalty of New Spain. There was a new governor, and that governor ruled that there would be a Spanish leader, tyrant, basically was the word they used, in each of the pueblos. So sent out to these 29 Native American communities were Spanish rulers and Franciscan friars that brought about the conversion of the native people, forced conversion to Roman Catholicism. Now, getting back to Acoma, Father Juan Ramirez was sent there, and he began building the church in 1629. And between 1629 and 1641, using forced labor, they moved over 18,000 tons of adobe and straw and sandstone from the valley up to the top of the mesa. And they went into the mountains nearby to Mount Taylor, 40 miles away, and carried home all of the timber that they needed for the roof and the walls. If you go and visit that church, it's still intact today with those timbers and with the original paintings and drawings. It's a 6,000 square foot church, and the altar is flanked by high wood pillars 60 feet high. I'm going to show you a picture of this place. I don't have an interior picture because they asked us not to take pictures inside, but the outside of the church looks like this.
Oh my gosh.
And this was the church built in 1640 that's still intact today, built by the Acoma people. And they did on the inside after 1700 decorate it with red and white designs that are both Christian designs, but also representative indigenous designs from the Kachinas. So in the 1700s, the Catholics were a little softer in their approach, but this building is really an incredible structure. And because it was built by their ancestors, they consider it a cultural treasure, and it's well worth seeing. So now we're up on the top of a mesa, and this is what you'll see. These houses come from the 1600s. These white ladders are the entrances to home kivas. So within these homes that have these white ladders is a sacred space for ritual right within the family compound. You can see in the distance here is a mesa. Acoma's built on a mesa just like this. So when you see these homes, they're up, towering over the valley there. And these homes have been continually occupied since the 1300s and are still occupied today. All right. The enforced Catholicism of the Franciscan order, needless to say, caused a huge backlash. And there was widespread resistance all through the 1600s. And the unrest came to a head in 1675 when the new territorial governor, Governor Trevino, ordered the arrest of 47 Pueblo medicine men, priests, Kachina leaders, accusing them in the Inquisition of being practicers of sorcery. 4 of the leaders were condemned to death and were hanged. The rest were publicly whipped and sentenced to life in prison. Well, This caused such widespread upset that the surrounding pueblos to Santa Fe marched on the colonial capital. Governor Trevino had to send out his troops to attack the Apache. And so Trevino left, allowed those medicine men, those religious leaders, to go free. And among them, set free in 1675, was a man named Pope. Pope returned to the Taos Pueblo, which is about 30 miles from Santa Fe, and immediately began organizing a revolution. And for the next 5 years, he traveled to other pueblos and tried to get their commitment to rise up against the Spanish. And finally, in 1680, there was an uprising of the 29 pueblos. Now, he had an ingenious way to launch the attack simultaneously. He sent out runners from Taos and sent them to all these different pueblos that stretch all the way almost into Arizona. And the runners untied a knot on a rope each day. And when they got to the pueblo, they gave the rope to the leaders and told them to untie one knot each day. And when the last knot was untied, they were to attack the Spanish. And it worked. On August 10th in 1680, simultaneous attacks in all of the pueblos drove the Spanish off of each of the pueblos, and they laid siege to the capital in Santa Fe. A total of 400 Spaniards were killed, and they killed 21 of the 33 Franciscan priests in the territory. So by August 13th, all the settlements had been closed and they'd laid siege to the governor. Finally, on August 21st, the governor took who was left and made their way out, and the Pueblo people let them leave, and they headed for El Paso. And so 1,500 Spaniards and 500 Indian slaves finally made it safe to El Paso. And there was a new rule of order in the pueblos of New Mexico under the leadership of Pope and his 2 lieutenants. So they organized to go back into the pueblos and to call upon the people to return to their most ancient practices. They had to call on their elders for memories because they had been disallowed of their practices back in 1600, and this was 80 years later. But Pope really pressed his people. They were to go back to their Puebloan names instead of using the Christian names they had been given. If they had been married in Christian ceremonies, they were to leave that woman and marry another Pueblo woman. They were not allowed to grow the grains that the Spanish had taught them, wheat and barley. And so Pope took a very fierce stance against the insurrection that the Spanish had brought. And many, as they talk about the history and study it, think he probably overstepped by being as fierce as he was. And the material existence of the Pueblo people, we're not sure whether it got better or worse without the Spanish available. So finally, Pope died in 1691. In 1692, the Spanish marched back into Santa Fe. Diego de Vargas, with only 60 soldiers and 100 auxiliary Indian fighters and 7 Franciscan priests, arrived at Santa Fe. They were unencumbered and unattacked, and they agreed to let the 1,000 people who were living, Pueblo people who were living in Santa Fe, to have amnesty if they reconverted to Roman Catholicism. And then over the next year and a half, they went Pueblo to Pueblo to reestablish Spanish rule. Well, as you look at this history, it's very clear that one of the primary factors that led to the Pueblo revolt was the forcible repression of the Pueblo religion. The Franciscans would call upon the governors and rulers to confiscate the masks and the dolls that made up the primary artifacts, the primary sacred tools, along with talking sticks. The idea of the talking stick comes from the Pueblo people. The Franciscans had rounded up all of that and destroyed that. Now, these masks and these dolls, they represent what are called Kachinas. And there's about 300 separate Kachina spirits. These are the spirits of the ancestors who taught the Pueblo people by making these masks and making these dolls how to have their spirit indwell in their communities.
Ooh, idolatry.
So here we are with this idea of Kachina, which you've maybe heard of Kachina dolls. Well, Kachina is the spirit, it's the doll, but it's also the dance. So it's the real heart and soul of the Native American religion that the Spanish tried to block out. I want to show you a picture of some Kachina dolls if you've not seen them before. So these are Kachina dolls. And to the Hopi and the Pueblo people, their secret names are known and their attributes that they represent. And then this is an older picture of an actual Kachina dance. So, as I said, the kiva, that sacred circular space that you enter from above, was also a key aspect of the Pueblo religions. There would be a sacred hole in the very bottom of the kiva that represented the navel of the earth. And it was in the kivas that people would be instructed in the mystery religions. And you see them everywhere among the Pueblos today, and certainly you see hundreds of them in the ruins of the Southwest. I want to show you this picture. I told you about the rebellion in 1680. One of the biggest churches that had been built was at what was called the Pecos Pueblo, and the native people tore down the church, this huge church. And then they built this big, beautiful sacred kiva right where the high altar of the church used to be. So this interaction, violent interaction between native spirituality and Roman Catholic spirituality. This is the church in ruins. This was simply one tower. This church was even bigger than that church I showed you at Acoma, but it was torn down and this kiva was built with its sacred entrance here. Well, after the Spanish came back, they had realized they had really overstepped. By this time, even back in Spain, the Counter-Reformation had come. There were beginning to be more consideration of the rights, human rights. And so the Spanish from 1700 until the Mexican Revolution had a much softer approach and not as deep a demand on orthodoxy. So that's when we have this 150-year period that through intermarriage, through, you have to admit it, rape and concubinage, there became the mestizo culture, the mixed culture. And this took place not only in race, but in religion. And so that's really the heart and root of Native American Roman Catholicism in the Southwest today. And you see the examples of this sort of synchronicity of religions. It was not a far leap to go from Kachinas, of which there were 300, to saints. And so certain saints became associated with certain of the Kachinas. Saint Stephen became the patron saint of the Acoma Pueblo. And each of the different Pueblos and their churches had a patron saint, but it was also tied to their native religion. The dances. Well, I think probably the most powerful synchronistic image is the Virgin of Guadalupe. Think how widespread that is among people in the South and the Southwest. Well, she became a stand-in for the Corn Mother, who had been a leading deity among the Kachinas. Also the dances. There's a set of dances called the Matachines. It's a fabulous mix of Spanish folklore and Native American folklore. And if you visit the Pueblo at San Lorenzo, the Matachine de San Lorenzo has been performed continually for over 300 years. And that's a public performance that you're allowed to watch. Well, it wasn't only the Native Americans, I mean, not only the Roman Catholics who had learned well, it was also the Native people themselves, and their religion became much more private, secret, and not shared with Westerners. And so if you go to especially Hopi Pueblo today, it's very fierce in the protection of the Native American religions. Well, I wanted to give you this just sort of a snapshot view of one of those beautiful pueblos, the Acoma Pueblo. How many Acoma Pueblo people were there at the time of first contact? It's estimated there were about 6,000. How many Acoma people are there today? 6,000. And one of them is our new Secretary of the Interior, Deb Hanlon. She's a member of what's called the Laguna Pueblo, but Laguna and Acoma Pueblos are actually totally interrelated. The same language, the same region. By myth, people left Acoma to create Laguna. And so today, for the very first time, we have a Native American person serving as the Secretary of the Interior. Okay, I'm going to stop there. I've gone on a little long. Like I said, it's a travel log for the state of New Mexico. When the virus lifts, I heartily recommend you book yourself down there to see such incredible ancient ruins and living tradition that you would find in and around Santa Fe and Albuquerque. So feel free to unmute yourself and any questions or comments anybody might have.
Thank you, Peter. Am I able to speak?
Yep, I can hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry, excuse me. My husband and I and the children went down there many years ago, and thank you for this because we were only at Canyon de Chelly and Mesa Verde, so Chaco Canyon. I don't have any idea why we didn't get there, but you have given us such in-depth coverage that I did not hear in any tour that we received. So thank you.
One of my favorite things at Chaco, the archaeology at Chaco began with cattle farmers that just started digging things up. And then finally in the 1920s, somebody from Harvard came and did what in that period was considered a classical well-done dig. And that's where all this mythology that these people simply disappeared. Well, since then we found out they didn't disappear at all. They had to abandon that because of a lack of water, but they simply moved into these other areas. So they had to redo the interpretive center entirely. And they went to the Hopi elders. And it was the Hopi elders that designed what you'll now see at the Chaco Canyon Interpretive Center of what life was like. And so it's interesting how history changes depending on who's writing it, but at least we're honoring that a little bit by letting the Hopi have a say in how we interpret what are their ancestral places.
Is there any, what sort of agriculture is done now? You mentioned that they, Spaniards maybe had introduced the barley and the wheat and then.
Who were the northern crops?
Yeah, well, maize was the primary crop.
Right.
but also they had extensive trading down into Mexico. When they opened Chaco Canyon at Pueblo Bonito, they opened up a room in which there were 450 Macau parrots laid out.
Wow.
And this was the storeroom for the ceremonial robes that they had traded for parrots from as south of Mexico City in order to have their ritual dance. You know, my own theory that's a little bit supported is the high ritual that they had was based on the agricultural seasons.
Yes.
And they would do these huge pilgrimages to Chaco. And they have these ancient roads that are built in the desert that are made out of stone that are 15 feet wide, but they never had the wheel. These were walking roads. But everyone would come to Chaco for the ritual, and then everyone would take home from the bounty of the whole community whatever stored grain they might need for the coming season. So the agricultural season, sort of like what I think the temple in Jerusalem was too, that they would do, you know, if you're in the temple in Jerusalem and you're sacrificing 5,000 rams, that's a lot of ram meat. And so you're going to be giving that out to the people. And I think that's the same thing that happened among the Chaco people.
You ask him, honey, right here. He's right
Peter,
there.
why did the Spanish try to swap out a successful green crop maize for an unsuccessful one, wheat and barley?
Well, you know, it's similar to what the English first tried in the colonies. I'm not sure why, especially with the water issues that they were suffering, because so much of the how native people grew corn is they would sprinkle the kernels along rivers, streams, and beds. But when the Spanish came, they created it into square fields. So I think that they only had a certain model in their head of what could work, and they certainly weren't going to take the advice and the learning of the native folks. And so I think they just imposed what they knew, and they had already done that down in Mexico. Remember, Cortez and everything was about almost 100 years before all of this. And so whatever they used to colonize in the south of New Spain, they simply used those same practices to colonize in the north.
And failed.
And totally different climate and totally different soil.
Yeah.
And so,
Jerry, did you want to unmute yourself? Did you have a question? Oh, Jerry, you need to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, now we can hear you.
Okay. Regarding the Kachina spirits, so the people were praying to these idols or these dolls. That was part of their religion.
Well, yes. You would be given a kachina at a certain point in your spiritual development that represented that aspect, and you would have that in your home. And then that same spirit would be part of the team of dancers. But both the dance and the totem were not like magical powers. They simply, you know, sort of like the Eucharist is for us a gateway to the body and blood of Christ. The masks and the dance and the doll were a gateway to the spirits of the ancestors of the Kachinas. I wish I could have
How did
taken
they use
pictures.
talking sticks?
I wish I could have taken pictures inside the church in Pueblo, in Acoma, because right beside stencils of the cross and of the chalice, there were stencils of some of the Kachinas.
How did they use the talking stick?
I'll have to figure that. I haven't been able, and in some ways I'm feeling a little strange trying to research this now that, they're sort of the folks, especially the Hopi. It's not so much some of the other Pueblos, but the Hopi people are really wanting to guard their practice from our knowledge. So But if I find out something about a talking
Yeah.
stick, I'll let you know.
So then that perhaps was the reason for the violent interaction between the Catholic Church?
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
Okay.
There was
Thank
one
you.
article that I read that the native people made the connection between talking sticks and crucifixes. And so they would take the
Oh.
talking, they were allowed to have crucifixes. And so they would have that and they would incorporate that into whatever way they used their talking sticks. So
I see.
Peter,
yeah.
this is Alice Foreman, and
Hey, Alan.
the Heard Museum. I haven't been in the Heard Museum for quite a while, but Barry Goldwater, Senator Barry Goldwater, gave a huge collection of Kachina dolls.
Oh, really?
I remember them. So if you're in Phoenix, go to the Heard. This
Okay.
is very long ago that I was there. Matter of fact, about 1990, 91. And there is a wonderful, the Indian market that they used to have there, but these dolls are unbelievable.
I can imagine.
And if you have a chance to see them, it's wonderful. But I was in Albuquerque and Santa Fe, and we went up to see the ruins, a lot of ruin, and it's fascinating. But what you're telling me now is the better story, so I know what I was seeing.
Yeah, there's a beautiful, very accessible set of ruins outside of Santa Fe called Bandelier.
That's where we were.
Yeah, and that's a nice interpret. Like Chaco Canyon, you have to go down dirt roads. It's a bit of a rough trip to get back in there. But like Pecos and Bandelier, you can do a half-day visit out to them. And when you're in Santa Fe and you are there at the Indian market on the steps of the Palace of Governors, that is the exact building that the governor led his people out of in 1680.
Oh my gosh.
I mean, that is the square in Santa Fe is still the same square it was during the Pueblo revolt.
This is great. Thank you.
And
Yeah.
the talking stick and the idea that there was a group of people in a meeting and one stick. He who held the stick talked.
That's certainly how we've appropriated it and used it. We've used that tool a lot of times.
Alan and I were able to go on, not that long ago, a 1-week tour. We did not go to Acoma, but we went to Mesa Verde and all over. And one of the things that impressed us then was places which had, the Christian places had accommodated some of the native tradition. And we saw that also when we went to the Marquesa Islands, where the Catholic priests had come and did the same thing they did to the American Indians and actually made them take their worship places apart and rebuild the churches. But now in the Marquesa Islands, the Christian churches incorporate a lot of the native traditions.
Yeah.
And also you see that now in Hawaii, when you go to the Episcopal churches that we go to when we're visiting Hawaii, again, they bring some of the native, so there's maybe a little hope that's redeeming that we've allowed that we superimposed a religion on them, that we were now at least giving some respect to their traditions.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Don?
Peter, this is John.
Yes.
Here.
Yeah.
So recurring back to Onate, there's a story that's been running around about Onate's foot. In 1998, on the day of the celebration of the 400th centenary of the Spanish, I suppose, Onate's entrance into New Mexico, a group of American Indians cut the foot off of a gigantic there's a big statue I think in Espinoza.
Uh-huh.
12 foot, they cut the foot off the statue.
Oh,
But they put a note on it saying, this is in memory of our, the Acoma
the Acoma people.
brothers. And that story, that foot was not found until relatively recently.
Oh, wow.
And I've kind of forgotten the story of finding it, but basically a letter was sent to somebody, to the news, in a very indirect way. But
Oh,
I think Onati's foot has been.
What a protest. An eye for an eye and a foot for a foot.
A foot for a foot, yeah. There's a greater, in a podcast, in 99% Invisible, tells the story of this. Anyway,
That's what a great protest. Oh my gosh. Yeah.
So how do I get rid
Oh,
of it?
go ahead and unmute yourself.
So Peter, in light of this history, is there now a modern equivalent now? Have the Pentecostals come along and made great inroads into that part of the world?
Yes, Pentecostalism fit Native American spirituality on another level because of the ecstatic part of it. A lot of the purpose of these dances is to achieve an ecstatic state.
Yeah.
And so a religion like Pentecostalism that has at the heart of some of its worship trying to achieve an ecstatic state, there have been great inroads made.
Yeah. That's what I expect.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we need to finish up. Thank you all so much. And next week we're going to come right back, and we're going as white as you can get. We're going to talk about the mainline denominations of Christianity, and what does that mean, and where did that come from, and what effect has that had on Christianity in America. So that'll be next week's talk. So hopefully you'll tune in for a coffee hour at 10 till 10, and then we'll have about a half-hour talk and some time for discussion. So thank you.
Peter, this has been great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.
All right.
Yeah, very good.
Thank you.
A lot.
Okay, see you next week.
Sure.
Bye.
Yeah, good. Bye.
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 Hi, everyone. Take
Bye
care.
then.
Okay.